Okay, we'll get started now that the technical part's out of the way. So last week we discussed two other sets of texts considered sacred by Muslims, the Hadith and the Sunnahs. I talked about how they relate to the Quran, how they can complement or further elaborate on the commands that are in the Quran, and how they dictate many aspects of Muslim life. We compared those texts to similar texts in Judaism, such as the Talmud, and then sort of discussed what additional texts or commandments outside of the Bible that Christians are required to follow, which are, we don't have all of those, right? So this week, though, we're going to cover other key beliefs of Muslims and areas of conflict between Islam and Christianity. So, where's my thing? All right, so some of this is, we've talked about a little bit. I'm not going to belabor it, but Muhammad is the last and final prophet. So, that's one of the basic tenets of their faith. And he led an exemplary life and was a perfect human being. So we've talked about that quite a bit. And that he came face to face with God and conversed with Allah. Or face to face with and conversed with Allah. This is when if you remember, I described a trip that he was basically transported from Mecca to Jerusalem. And during that time, he went through what was called the 7 steps of heaven. He's the only prophet to have gone through the 7th step, which is meeting face to face with Allah. So there is some debate as to whether he actually saw Allah with his own eyes or saw him with his heart. One of the hadiths said, when asked if he had seen Allah, Muhammad answered, "He is light. How could I see him?" And yet there's others that say he claimed to have actually been face to face with Allah. Or with God. So, Louise, if you don't mind, can you read that verse for me? Thank you. So, in the Bible, in the Old Testament in particular, there's several instances of Moses, Elijah, and others having an encounter with God, but they never see him face to face, right? In fact, there's some quotes in Scripture about man can't survive seeing God face to face, and yet, if there's some conflicts, as I said, but if Muhammad claims that he saw God, saw Allah, then that's a big difference from what we believe, from what we know from the Bible. I also talked about this several times about the Muslims' view of the Christian belief in the triune God. Some believe that to be a form of polytheism, right? And they blame Paul for that, the Apostle Paul. So here's a quote from a Muslim scholar. It says, "It's a pity that the existing Gospels do not present the mission of Jesus so precisely and clearly as it has been presented in the Holy Quran. Nevertheless, all the 3 basic things are scattered throughout the books, the holy books. So Muslims are taught that Jesus and the apostles were directed and inspired by Allah, but that Paul hijacked Christianity when he convinced people to worship Jesus as God. We know that it wasn't just Paul, right? John made it pretty clear that Jesus is God. They also have a real problem with the whole idea of the Holy Trinity. So they don't believe that there is a Holy Trinity, or a triune God. It goes against what we described in one of the earlier sessions about Shahada. There is only one God, and that God is Allah, and they just consider Allah as just a singular being. So they have a problem with the 3 persons versus one being, which is obviously different than the way we believe. And so there's, I'm certainly not going to try to delve into describing or explaining the Holy Trinity, because that's we just don't have enough Sundays left for all of that. No, but I will do this, though. I am going to go out on a limb here, and there's a quote by Tertullian. Has anybody heard of Tertullian? He's an early church father from around 150 A.D. to about 200 something. He was one of the first, at least in the Western church, to really try to describe the Holy Trinity. And in Latin, his term was una substantia tre personae, which means that one substance and three persons. He was sort of one of the foundations of the Western church definition of the Trinity. And so if you ever want to get to the root of of some of the early teachings about the Trinity, Tertullian would be a good place to look. All right, so some other key beliefs, though, that we haven't really gone over before. So I mentioned there's these 5 pillars of Islam, things that they do or are required to do in Islam. But then there's these 6 articles of faith. One of them is sort of one of the pillars, the Shahada, but is one God, Allah. That they call that the Tawheed. There are unseen spiritual beings called jinn. They're like, some of them are good, but most of them are not. They're like demons, like we would consider demons. Allah sent prophets into this world, and he gave those prophets sacred scripture. And there will be a day of judgment, which is similar to what we know. And Allah's decree is sovereign over the universe. So these articles of faith are not something that they have to act on like some of the 5 pillars. They're not things that they have to act on, but it's things that they have to consider or keep in mind. Now, we're also going to talk about their views of heaven and hell and blasphemy and apostasy. And this gets interesting. And then there's others that we'll talk about as well. All right, so here, I'm sorry, this is very hard to read, but I couldn't make it bigger. But I'll read this out to you because it's kind of interesting. This is sort of a description of hell in the Quran. So those who deny their Lord, for them will be cut out a garment of fire. Over their heads will be poured out boiling water. With it will be scalded what is within their bodies as well as their skins. In addition, there will be maces of iron to punish them. Every time they wish to get away therefrom, from anguish, they will be forced back, and it will be said, taste the penalty of burning. So this is a scripture or a verse in the Quran. The next one down is, in front of such a one is hell, and he is given for drink boiling fetid water. And then for eating, you get the tree of Zakum. I guess that's how you pronounce that. But verily, the tree of deadly fruit will be the food of the sinful. Like molten lead will it boil in the belly, like the boiling of burning despair. Doesn't sound too pleasant. Their version of hell. And so, you contrast that with the Christian view of hell. So the Christian view of hell is the main issue is that we're eternally separated from God. And it's in the Old Testament, there are stories of, the sort of the fire and brimstone and all of that, but that's sort of the traditional view of it. But there's the spiritual view that people like C.S. Lewis and others had of hell, and that's the eternal separation. And this is key to what we're going to talk about as we go further, but it's a lack of relationship with God. And one of the differences with Allah is that there's not really a relationship with God. And you've seen that in some of the other things I've talked about and as what's coming up, especially when we start talking about heaven. And then, the other view is annihilationism, is that there is no hell. If you go to heaven, you're with God, but if you don't, your body ceases to exist. And is that the one? Is that the Deuteronomy one that I was going to ask you about? I'm trying to remember where I put the Deuteronomy quote because I didn't have it in my note here. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, no, sorry, not yet. My bad. There was another quote that I forgot to mark on here in pencil, but anyhow, a nihilist look at a quote from the scripture that I didn't write down that says that you're basically destroyed or cease to exist, right? And they use that for justification. So if you're a Muslim and you go to hell, you're continuously tormented. It's all about the torture things. Whereas for us, it's there may or may not be that, but the torture is really your separation from God. I heard to me, it was one of the most terrifying quotes or thoughts on hell that I've ever seen, and it wasn't the fire and brimstone and all of that. It was somebody's definition of hell was it's like being in solitary confinement with absolutely nothing. You're allowed to be your own God, just like you always wanted. So you get to go to hell, and you get to be there with your own thoughts, your own everything for eternity, with nothing else, no one else. And I thought that sounds worse than boiling fetid water. So, all right. So let's move on. So then, what is their description of heaven? So heaven, their description of heaven is a beautiful garden. It's filled with greenery, flowing water, and the Arabic word Jannah, which is, so Jahannan is hell, Jannah is garden. And both men and women are admitted to heaven. Many families will reunite. The Quran's description of heaven includes plentiful food and drink without any feelings of satiation or intoxication. And heaven is understood to be a place of everlasting life. One of the things I read, there's a scripture in the Quran that says, thrones of dignity, no harmful speech or falsehood. They will recline with ease on thrones of dignity arranged in ranks. So heaven's this garden. You get to sit and relax, and you basically get to live in paradise for eternity. But it doesn't say anything about living in the presence of God. What's that? The virgins? Oh, yeah. Well, that's true. I don't know where that's something in the Quran. I should have spent some time on that, but you do hear that in the news media when a Muslim martyr says they're going to do something and die for Islam, that they get to live in heaven in paradise with 77 virgins or whatever it is. I'm not sure. Yeah, that would have been a good one to look up. I should have done that. But yeah, big difference in once again, this is all leading towards, as we get towards the end here, relationship with God. How do Muslims versus Christians view your relationship with God? All right, so another big thing is blasphemy and apostasy. So blaspheming Allah and worshiping anyone else is the one unforgivable sin. So what is blasphemy? In Islam, blasphemy is the disrespectful, impious utterance or actions concerning God. It's not like just saying things either. It can also be mocking or vilifying the attributes of Islam. It can be denying the fundamental beliefs of the religion, which is one of the reasons why you see so many people get upset when somebody says something bad about Muhammad or mocks Muhammad or something like that. So some examples of that would be denying the Quran, or that the Quran was divinely revealed, or the prophethood of one of the Islamic prophets, one of the other prophets that we discussed, like David, Solomon, Moses, any of the others. Insulting an angel or maintaining that God had a son. So there's a key area of conflict between us and Muslims, because just maintaining that God had a son takes away from Allah's oneness, which is one of the most sacred tenets of their religion. So what is the punishment for blasphemy? Well, if you look at verse 533, which I did mark this one, fortunately. um, that's often used. It says, "Those that make war against God and his messenger and spread disorder in the land shall be put to death or crucified, or have their hands and feet cut off on alternate sides, or be banished from the country." So, just like back in Old Testament times, blaspheming God could be punishable by stoning. But there's other parts in here where blasphemy is not necessarily a capital punishment, but a lot of the Islamists use that verse that I just described to punish people or to burnish their own religious credentials or justify, capital punishment for political reasons within where they're at. So, what did Christ say the punishment for blasphemy should be? He really didn't, did he? I mean, he was pretty tolerant, and he would say he would shake the dust off your feet if you go into a place and you're not treated well or his word is not accepted. But he wasn't one to say, "Oh my goodness, you disrespected me, the son. You should be killed." In fact, it was the opposite. I think he felt like loving your neighbor, loving your brother was the surest way to bring them closer to you. So that's another major difference. And it's interesting that there's a lot of religions. Well, now we get into apostasy. So apostasy is the formal abandonment, rejection, or renunciation of Islam by a Muslim. So blasphemy, you could be a Muslim or not, but if you insult Allah or the Muhammad or whatever, you're blaspheming Allah. And but apostasy is when you are a Muslim, and now you're saying, "You know what? I'm going to convert to Christianity, or just atheism, or whatever it might be," and you're rejecting the faith. And next week we're going to talk a lot about what that means for that person who does that. But the definition is that you're rejecting their faith, and that is a big no-no. If you cause that, like when we lived in UAE, there was a pretty tolerant society there. They had mosques, or they had temples for the Hindus, and they had churches for us and everything. But you weren't allowed to proselytize, and the one thing you couldn't do was to try to convert a Muslim. If you did, there was no questions asked. You're on the next plane out. You were gone. Apostasy is a big deal, and one of the things that, like Louise and I were talking before, she read this book I'm basing a lot of this on. This Nabil Qureshi, he committed apostasy basically right when he left the Muslim faith. So his family wasn't too happy about that, and we'll talk about that next week. All right. How are we doing on time? All right, so other key beliefs. So touched on this briefly in another way, but they do believe in polygamy, or the ability for polygamy to have up to 4 wives. But it's not quite the same as, at least what I've heard or know of from the this thing's getting all over the place. Is like the Mormon faith, for example, or the older Mormon faith. You can have up to 4 wives, but only if the man can treat each fairly with time and resources. The intent for the phrase is in here, and it's in 4:3 here. Let me find this. If you fear that you cannot deal fairly with orphan girls, you may marry women of your choice, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you might not be able to treat them with equal fairness, then only 1. Or those whom you rightfully possess, that is more likely to keep you from committing an injustice. And give the women their dowers willingly, but if they of their own accord remit any part of it to you, you may make use of it with pleasure and goodwill. So that's one of the verses that supports polygamy, but in the Quran it was put in there in this section about orphan and widows, and it has some parallels to the Old Testament. If you remember, there's several places in Scripture where a man was told, for example, to marry his sister-in-law because the brother died, right, and to continue the family line. In this case, it was the intention, or is believed by scholars, the intention was that a man could marry another woman, like that were an orphan or a widow, someone, and it was a way of showing support and care for these people. I'm sure that it wasn't always done that way, just like it probably was never always done that way in Old Testament times for us, but that was the original reason. The wife, in a lot of these cases, has the right to stipulate only one wife in her marriage contract. So I found that kind of interesting. That, and I'm sure that's somewhat cultural. Probably depends on where you are and what sort of influences family have on both sides of that relationship. The one thing that's interesting, though, so polygamy is this broad term for someone having multiple husbands or wives. I think we think of it here in the U.S. as being a man having multiple wives. But that's polygyny. And then there's also polyandry. Polyandry is when a woman has multiple husbands. You don't see that too often. And then the one that was really interesting is called polygynandry. And that's where multiple men and multiple women have multiple wives and multiple husbands. And that one was a little strange, but didn't want to spend too much time researching that because I didn't know what would come up. All right, so the other thing is idols. All right, so idols is there's similarities to like a lot of the definitions in the Old Testament, but the Islam takes it further by banning pictures and sculptures, etc., anything that competes with the Creator. So that's the reason why you don't see pictures of Muhammad. And if you remember, I don't know, it was like 10 years or so ago, I can't remember if it was Denmark. Anyhow, somebody drew like a cartoon of Muhammad in this periodical, created a huge stir. For one, the cartoon was deemed disrespectful, but nobody draws pictures of Muhammad. You're not supposed to do that. So why is that? Well, in Islam, they don't want any pictures of any of God's creation, any animals, anything depicting living creatures, because they don't want them to become idols. And if you remember, prior to Muhammad starting to preach Allah and monotheism in Mecca and everything, it was a very polytheistic society. It was a society that worshipped all kinds of things, snakes and camels and whatever. You can understand the genesis of this. And like I say, there's parallels within the Old Testament. I mean, it didn't take long for the Israelites to start worshiping a golden calf, right? So you can sort of understand why that evolved. That's one of the reasons why Muslims, I think, have a problem with the Catholic cross, because the cross usually has a depiction of Jesus on the cross, and they view that as idol worship, besides the fact that you're worshiping Jesus as a God. So Trish and I had the chance to go into several mosques, and I'm going to show some pictures next week. But if you go in the mosque, you won't see pictures. Like if you go in a cathedral, a lot of times you'll see pictures of saints, you'll see sculptures, angels, cherubim, things like that. You won't see that in any of the mosques. They're beautiful. They're absolutely stunning, some of the mosques that we've been in. But they're geometric patterns. So when you see a home, maybe, that they're going to be decorated in colors and geometric patterns and things like that, but you won't see sculpture of a moose or a bison or something like somebody would see in one of our homes around here. So they intentionally avoid depictions of living creatures. Another area that's really different is the concept of original sin. So Islam rejects the concept of original sin. They believe that every person is born into a state of purity. Without ancestral guilt, individuals are held completely accountable for their choices. They believe that Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree, but then they asked God for forgiveness. They repented and they were forgiven by God. And they believe that children are born pure and held accountable, or not held accountable until they reach an age of maturity. Okay, here we go. Muslims point to Deuteronomy 24:16. Thank you. So, once again, we're working our way towards relationship with God. They believe that they're born pure. They sin, as we talked about before. They can get almost daily absolution from sins. They believe that good outweighs bad, and that they do believe in Allah's grace, but it's in Allah's grace in judgment of good versus bad when the day of judgment comes. And so then we get down to works versus grace. So this kind of sums up a lot of this, how we view God and our relationship with him. They believe that they can work their way towards salvation. They believe that, whereas we know that there's no way possible we could make up for that. And it all comes back to this idea that we're born fallen in a fallen world, and we need the sacrifice that God provided through Jesus for us to become saved and be able to live with God. And then we live in a relationship with him as opposed to just living in this very nice retirement community that he provided for us. So, starting to run out of time, so I won't go. One other thing I was going to talk about is usury and interest. So in the Quran, Muslims are not to charge interest or usury. They're not to invest in things that pay back interest. So if I were to loan you money, I would just loan it to you. You would not pay it back to me, with 5% interest or something like that. Or in your case, I'd only give you 3%. So, but the thing, what they are allowed to do, for example, though, is a bank can do like a lease-to-own agreement, and that's how you can lend money to someone. Or a bank can buy the property and then sell it back at a higher cost. Or the bank can go into a partnership with you on a business deal, and that way, in a sense, the bank's lending you the money, but then they get some of the profits from the business back. All right, I know we're running out of time, but just bear with me a little bit longer. Two other things I wanted to talk about is haram and halal. So this is similar to the concept, the Jewish concept of kosher or not. So something that's haram is forbidden, prohibited, or sinful. There's kind of two types. There's behaviors that are strictly forbidden in the Quran or the Hadith, and then there's that are my note here, that are like thou shalt not murder or something like that. And then there's some that are actions that are based on cultural things. So, for example, eating pork, consuming alcohol, as I just mentioned, interest in usury. The things such as cursing, fornication, murder, disrespecting one's parents, certain foods and drinks, and then there's halal, which are things that are permissible or lawful. But there are some halal things that may not be halal that become haram under certain conditions. So, for example, you can eat a certain animal, say beef, but they also have prohibitions against eating meat with blood in it, just like in the Old Testament. And so that's haram if you don't get all the blood out of the animal before you try to eat it. So they do have, the other things are haram, are cross-dressing, same-sex marriage, homosexuality, things like that. So anyhow, I just wanted to spend this day just talking about some additional differences in areas of conflict. Next week will be the last week of this series. We're going to talk about what it means to be a Muslim who converts or moves away from the church, and then we'll also, or from Islam into our church, and then also talk about some resources and things that you can look for if you want to learn more about this or talk to Muslims about it. So that's it. Thank you. Appreciate your time and patience this morning.